So, we're going to talk about the scientific study of the visual language of comics. So, the main question here, as we all see, this is, hopefully people can tell, a comic page, there's a sequence of images, they're arranged, and the big question we want to know is, how is it that you understand these things? What is it that enables you to understand this, and how is this structured, things like that. So, there's three main questions that we it's not just what's going on in those sequences on their own, but how do people how does their cognition operate upon them? And finally, what are the properties of various comics? So not, say, the idea of comics in the abstract, which I'll get to in a little bit, but what is the property of actual works, and what are they doing? And so I'm going to make a couple bold statements about these questions. The first statement that I'm going to make is that these are all cognitive questions. So in order to answer these questions, you have to address the aspect of mind and brain and cognition. These things are not just floating in the cultural ether. They're not somehow just properties of stuff outside of the brain. Fundamentally, these are issues related to cognition. Secondly, which we're going to get more into, is that the answer to these questions can only be studied using a scientific method. And I'm going to get further into that throughout this talk, and what I mean by using a scientific method. So, the argument that I've made in my recent book, The Visual Language of Comics, which has been out for about a year and a half now, is that the structure of the system that comics are written in is structured similarly to language. So that is that the structure of sequential images shares certain linguistic features that is found across all languages. Just like in languages, there's no universal visual language. There's cross-cultural diversity of structures. So why is it, for example, that Japanese manga look different than American superhero comics? They are literally written in different visual languages. There's a Japanese visual language that has its structures, and there's an American visual language, or multiple American visual languages, that have their own structures. And those are reflecting of the shared cognitive structures across many people. And this is also maybe why hardcore readers of American superhero comics don't like reading manga necessarily, because they are written different, they have different structures that might be uncomfortable to your brain, given that you have built up a certain patterns, and vice versa. And finally, that we might expect there to be overlapping cognitive processing as other languages. So that would be to say that this visual language is processed in the brain the same as spoken or sign languages. This is actually one of my main focuses of research, is doing brain science. I don't have in this presentation plans to talk about that explicitly, but I do have some additional things that we can talk about if there's time at the end during question and answers that people would like to be like, hey, show us some brain science, so I'll show some brain science. All of this is discussed in my book, which I will just throw out as some shameless pandering. I do have copies available with me, and I will be, after this presentation, at booth number 2445, which is the Reading with Pictures booth, who's been kind enough to host us. And so if you want to chat with us about more things that we don't get to during this presentation, or pick up a copy of my book, or inquire further, we will be there following this presentation. It's at booth 2445. It's essentially right behind the Marvel booth. So come say hi, and you can get it. Okay. So I want to emphasize in this analogy between the structure of the sequences of images and the structure that comics are written in and comics that I am not saying that comics are a language. Comics are not a language. Okay, so if you believe that that is what I'm saying, you have gotten it wrong. Okay, comics are not a language. That is not, no X, no, not the message. Comics are not a language. Okay, it's more like this. Okay, so something like manga or comics are a sociocultural context. All right, that sociocultural artifact uses a visual language and a written language. So in the case of manga are written in Japanese visual language and Japanese. The Japanese visual language is the drawings part. Okay? So this contrasts with McLeod's idea that comics are sequential images. That's not correct. Sequential images are the visual language in which different types of comics are written, okay? So comics are, let's call this American superhero comics. American superhero comics are written in American visual language and English, the same way that manga are written in Japanese visual language and Japanese. Notice that this is the same analogy that we would say with something like novels. Novels are written in English. It would be crazy talk to say that novels are English, right? That would be really weird to say that. That's the equivalent of saying comics are sequential images. Okay? So rather, we say that novels are written in English, and comics are written in a visual language and a written language. Okay? So that's the analogy there. Okay, so in order to study this visual language, we can draw upon the same methods that we use to study other types of languages. So, theoretical research, which is what we're going to talk about first. Then we're going to talk about experimentation and corpus analysis. Experimentation is like people taking experiments. Corpus analysis is coding across lots of comics. And we're going to talk about each of these. And the overall message is that in order to understand what exactly is going on in these things, you have to have all three of these things combined. Okay, so we're going to start off with some theory. So theoretical research usually follows a research method like this. You make some observation of constructs that happen in this case comics, in the visual language of comics. Hey, there's this thing, okay? Now you want to know how that thing operates. So you manipulate that construct. And the way that you might manipulate that construct is maybe by deleting things related to it, or moving things around, or substituting something for another thing. So we're going to give some examples of this right now. So let's go through some of the structure of visual language. So one of the aspects of the visual language of comics is this visual vocabulary. So what I've argued is that these are all a kind of class of vocabulary items. So this is not all iconography. This is just something that floats above characters' heads. I liken these to affixes. These are affixes that are up, so they call them upfixes. Okay? So upfixes are a class of things that float above characters' heads. And it's not just that these are memorized instances, but this is an abstract class, so you can create new ones of things floating above characters' heads. And these are motivated, I should say, if you really like this image, I have this on a t-shirt on my website, in full color. So this is constrained by certain constraints. So how do we find out about the constraints? Well, we manipulate the structure. Okay, so a normal upfix might look like this, right? It's above the head, character's happy, smiling, and you know this has something to do with inspiration. Well, I've said that this has to be above the head. It can't necessarily be next to the head and be comprehended quite as well. It's a little weirder. Okay, but the meaning is maybe recoverable. It's a little weirder if the face disagrees with the upfix. So if there has to be some sort of relationship between face and upfix. So a sleeping face maybe looks a little weirder, and it's even weirder if you do both of those. So there's some constraints on how this structure operates. Now, this could be true if it was just the fact that we memorize these individual cases, right? But you can do these same sort of things to novel upfixes that maybe don't occur quite as conventionally, and you have the same sorts of effects. So this gives us a clue that there is an abstract class of things going on. So let's talk a little about the narrative grammar. The narrative grammar is essentially how sequences of images make sense. So one theory that you might have is that we simply look at the meaning relationships across panels. So changes in characters, causation, spatial locations, time, and note what those sorts of changes in meaning between sequential images might be. And this was the approach that was used by Scott McCloud in positing panel transitions. I'm guessing that many people here are probably familiar with this, right? So a lot of heads. Yes. Okay, so unfortunately, panel transitions are not enough. And they can't account for many things that happen in the comprehension of sequential images. I have some brain science that says that, but here's some quick examples. So these images might be harder to understand what they mean on their own. Now if you have a panel transition, it means that you need to know the content of both panels in order to kind of subtract out what the difference is. But if you don't know what the individual images mean, that might be harder to do. Of course, if you see these images in context, they fully become understandable. That means there has to be some sort of top-down knowledge given to you from the sequence itself that enables you to understand the individual image. Similarly, in a sequence like this one, you might notice that these two panels kind of go together as a group. And these four panels go together as a group that transcends just the kind of linear relationships between them. So what I've posited is there's actually kind of a structure whereby individual panels play roles in relationship to a larger whole. So a sequence might start with an establisher, which kind of sets up the situation, an initial, which gives you some sort of starting point, preparatory action. There's a climax and a peak, and the release has kind of a resolution or denouement. Now, all of these comprise a narrative arc, which should sound normal to people, like, yeah, this sounds like normal traditional narrative notions. Mine is a little bit more operationalized, but it's similar. We can expand that, though. Now, if we add these two images here, we have kind of a preparatory action of an initial, and then a little mini climax of a peak of the completed action. But these two panels as a grouping relate to the other grouping in a hierarchic way. So these two panels set up this sequence here, which summarizes the kind of main point of the sequence. So we have this hierarchical relationship. So how do I go about analyzing this phenomenon? All right. So we're going to talk you through the process that we go through to arrive at these sorts of analyses, right? So what it might seem like is like I just kind of like wave my hands and then these things get assigned labels, right? And actually that's not what happens. We actually have a very kind of consistent methodology that we go through. So the first thing that we might be able to, we're going to talk through this sequence here. The first thing we might guess is that we might say, well, let's look at what the meaningful elements are and use those meaningful elements to give us clues as to what categories we think things might have. So, for example, the aspects of meaning in these panels here, I usually like to start with things that I think are peak panels, because those are the key points of the sequence. So, in these panels we see primary actions happening, full completed actions are going on here. So we might assume that because of that, these might be peak panels. We're taking a guess. I think these might be peak panels. In a panel like this one and this one, we see a preparatory action that happens to come before the peak panel. So we might say, oh, I think these are maybe initial panels, right? Because they set up that peak panel. And in these ones here, we see that these are relatively passive states, and they do happen as somewhat aftermaths to panels that come before them, the peak panels. So we might guess that this is a release panel, right? So these are our hypotheses now about what these things are. So now we can do different techniques to confirm whether we're actually right. So first off, we're going to do a diagnostic test of deletion. So I should say that all of the manipulations that I've been doing here are things that we've done in experimentation also. And that will speak to our next section that we're going to talk about in this presentation. So we've seen that if you delete peaks, the sequence gets a little harder to understand. The sequence is less good, okay? So if I delete this panel, and if you were to read this as just a sequence on its own, that's a little bit worse of a sequence, right? Similarly, you can do the same thing here. It's a worse sequence if you don't have that panel. You might be forced to do a lot more inference, okay? So, or it's just straight bad. So, because of that, we might then say that, yeah, we think these are peak panels because they fail the deletion test, okay? But releases, these things that are kind of more resolution things, usually pass a deletion test better. So if we delete this panel, sequence is still relatively decent, okay? And if we delete this panel here, sequence is still relatively decent, although it has kind of an abrupt ending, and maybe there's no kind of nice, comfortable resolution to it. It just kind of like suddenly halts, right? But of the sequence that remains, that's relatively understandable. So we might think that that indeed is a release. So we could do this for every panel in the sequence. Let's now turn to looking for these groupings, this constituent structure. So here what we're going to do is what it's called, I call a sliding window test. So what we're going to do is we're going to take only a selection of the sequence and then make judgments on just those panels as if that was the whole sequence. So here we're going to use a 3-unit window, essentially. So this sequence here, as a sequence, is pretty understandable. You know, there's nothing weird about that. If we slide the window over, this as a sequence, as if it was only on its own, is a little bit weirder, right? Suddenly, the end of the sequence is like Snoopy looking like he's going to sneeze, and that's it. That's a little strange. This one is a little bit better, although it's a little weird why you start off with Charlie Brown and then suddenly go to Snoopy, right? So it's a little bit unusual still, as a sequence on its own. This one is also a little weird, but it's much better than those other ones, I think. Hopefully you'll agree with me, right? Hopefully give me some non-feedback, yeah, maybe. Okay? It's a little bit better, but still a little awkward. Like Snoopy suddenly disappears, why is he gone, how did he, what's going on here, right? So what we can do is if we line up all of these options, we can then see what our kind of analysis was. We look for where the common common bad things. In this case, it's this line here and this line here. So we might assume then that these are where the constituent breaks are. This is where the breaks between structures are. And in this case, it nicely lines up with the character change also. So we end up with a structure that maybe looks something like this. And so we go through these diagnostic tests to then tell us what this structure is. We don't just kind of like wave our hands and magically it appears. You go through this kind of methodology that tells you what the structure is. Okay, so from there, not only do images and sequence have meaningful aspects, but you can arrange those things on a page. So page layout is what I, in technical terms, call an external compositional structure, because it's external to the panel. An internal compositional structure would be how is the structure of the inside of the panel made up. So in this case, we know that this is separate from the structure of the meaning. Okay? And the way we know that is, again, because we can manipulate it. Because you can have 4 sequences like this in numerous different arrangements, and as long as those panels are read in the same order, the meaning is generally the same, for the most part. Okay? So page layout and meaning are 2 separate but interfacing components. All right. So what I've claimed about page layout is it is also structured in a hierarchic way. So a page like this is structured first by, we see there's a canvas. That canvas is not just a page. I tend to try to have a neutral term. It could be the side of a wall, it could be on a web page, on the internet, it could be on the side of a pottery, whatever. That's the canvas. So the order is now that we have a vertical downward motion in which we have 3 horizontal tiers, okay? 3 rows. The first row is made up of panels 1 and 2. The second is made up of 3 and 4. And then the final one first has another vertical tier that has 5 and 6 in it before moving to panel 7, okay? So we have this hierarchical structure of how the page is built. All right, so that's theory. That's some background theory. So now what we optimally want to know is, is this real? Am I just making this stuff up, or is this what is instantiated in people's heads when they actually read comics or engage with comics? So here we do actual experimentation of these theories. Okay, so here we have a page layout. All right, so I assume you are all astute comic readers. How many of you have heard that this sort of arrangement, this sort of layout is maybe hard for readers to understand? So, like a difficult sequence, right? And the reason why is because people claim that you're going to want to go this way like text, left to right, but this big one is here, so that's weird, okay? So we did an experiment looking at this. And what we did was we asked people, we gave you blank layouts like this, and we simply asked them to number these panels in the order that they would read them. And what we found was the rate at which people moved to the right was only 9%, less than 9%, okay? The rate at which people chose to go, that they said that they would go down, was actually 91%. All right? And only did people say they would move horizontally if we raised that boundary. So the further we raised that boundary, the more people said they would read horizontally. Okay? So what you see is a careful manipulation of this thing that we're testing, right? Everything else stayed the same. It's all the only thing that we manipulated. And we see that there's this nice stepwise pattern that appears out of this. So this gives us a clue as to what people's actual preferences are. So what I'm going to show you now is a more recent study that we've done. This is with a collaborator in Norway, David Wagner. And what you're going to see is actual eye tracking data of somebody's eye moving around a page. And we did the same sort of layout manipulation. So this is going to be a sequence, a comic by Jason, but we've rearranged the panels into different page layouts. So this little dot here is going to start moving around the screen, and that's somebody's eye moving around, eyes moving around the screen. So there's a couple things you might notice. They flitter around, but they don't scan the page first, right? As many people have claimed, you scan a page and then you read it. That's not true. So eye tracking data actually is very directed and focused. But you do see they kind of bounce around a little bit, which is exactly the same as what happens when reading text. Same sort of eye movements. Right. So these studies do show us what is happening in people's brains as they're comprehending comics. What people's eyes are doing, right? It doesn't necessarily speak to aspects of hierarchy. So in our second presentation by Barak Tazori, he's actually going to tell you about an experiment that we ran looking at whether people actually comprehend page layouts as having a hierarchical structure. Okay, that's some experimentation. corpus analysis is the third methodology that we can use. Corpus analysis is essentially looking at comics and tabulating what's going on in there. And this is exactly what Scott and Todd did in Understanding Comics when he looked at the rate at which panel transitions occur across different types of comics. Now, many people in comic scholarship have criticized McLeod, me being one of them. I actually don't think panel transitions are all that real cognitively, maybe a little bit, but there's a much bigger system going on that is not accounted for by transitions. But to his credit, he uses this more scientific sort of methodology. And I think he should be given credit for that, and I'm actually very surprised that other people have not followed the methodology that he used. So while people in comic scholarship have discussed the theories, some of them have just kind of blindly followed the theories, not many of them are actually doing the methodology that he laid out, or at least pushed towards, and I think that that's a shame, and that we need to do more of that. So he should be given credit for methodological things, I think. So in our case, what we do is a little beefed up version of this. So my students currently at least, have a comic page, and they have an open Excel spreadsheet. Each row here is a different panel, and they characterize the properties of panels. If you're going to do analysis of things that are below the panel level, you'd have each row be whatever that thing is, and maybe multiple rows occupy the amount of things you're talking about across a whole panel. From there, you can then take lots of averages across lots of books and average them out and to find larger proportionalities and things of what's going on. This data set is actually the data set that you're going to see in the last two presentations, which looked at American superhero comics from the 1940s through the last year, actually. And what we're looking at is gradual change in structure over time. In the first presentation by Caitlin Pedersen, she's going to look at aspects of page layout, or external compositional structure, essentially how the American superhero comics changed in the way that they have page layouts. And the second presentation is going to be by Ryan Taylor, who's going to use the same corpus, and he's going to talk about aspects of multimodality and text-image relationships, and the relationship to storytelling and how that's changed over the last 80 years in superhero comics. Okay, so just to summarize, the bold argument here is that this is the only way that we should really be studying how comics are built and structured and comprehended. Anything other than that is just hearsay. So I can make theoretical claims, but they should be testable, at least. And they should be able to be validated. So I do not believe that all theories are created equal. Okay? You can't have all theories created equal and say, well, that's just what that person believes. No. If I can do an experiment based on those claims and show that that's what people's cognition is actually doing, then that's the right theory and the other theory is wrong. Okay? So that's my bold statement about the way comic scholarship should be progressing. Because that's what science is, okay? And we should be doing a scientific method, all right? So this is my big advocacy for scientific research, which I try to lay out in my book, and I have another book coming out in December. It's an edited volume, makes that same case with other people's research in it as well.